Good afternoon, it's Valerie Ling, clinical psychologist and director founder for the Center for Effective Living. I hope you're well, I hope you've had lunch, and I hope you're keeping nice and cool and comfortable with the weather that we're having today. The clinical conversation that I'm having today is around separation anxiety. In particular, separation anxiety when it comes to children. It's been a couple of weeks now that we've had kids back at school, and just around my conversations at the practice, we've come across what has kids, I guess, after a couple of weeks back at school, still experiencing some anxiety separating from parents. So I want to talk to you about that today. Separation anxiety is actually a normal developmental part of a growing child's world, particularly in the preschool years. So probably you will find that a baby at 9 months old will start to experience separation anxiety, and then in the toddler years that can be quite common as well. And the basic explanation for that is young children at that age are beginning to realize that there is a world that is separate from them and their caregiver. When they're very, very young, their world is one where they're constantly in the physical presence of their caregiver. And so if they cry or if they show distress, that caregiver will be there, physically there. And as they're growing up and they're interacting with other children and as they're interacting with other adults, they're actually learning that that is not always the case. My caregiver may not always be around. And so separation anxiety basically comes from an inability to see that their caregiver will return, even if physically they're not there, even if they can't see them, and that nothing bad will happen to them or to their caregiver if there are brief moments of separation. Separation anxiety is also very common during adjustment and transition and high stress periods for a child. So particularly if they're going to school, if there's a new baby on the scene, if there are any changes to routine, anything that means that there could be a threat to their physical proximity and contact with their caregiver. So in the example of a new baby coming on the scene, it might actually start to trigger some separation anxiety in the youngest child. Not necessarily the youngest child, but maybe the one that feels a little bit more sensitive about a newcomer coming on board. So in transition stages, it also can be a common thing for separation anxiety to appear. Now, once we start moving past those sorts of transition periods and age appropriate separation anxiety, we start to look then at what makes separation anxiety a clinical diagnosis of separation anxiety disorder. And basically what makes that a diagnosis is if the anxiety and the distress is going on for more than 4 weeks without abating, without there being signs that the child is actually settling into the change. You're also then looking for a clustering of the distress around separation, not just in one area. And that could be, well, what I've just said. They could show intense separation and distress when they have to leave their caregiver and go to school or to someone else's house. There could be persistent worry that doesn't seem to ease, worries and thoughts about what's going to happen to their caregiver, whether something bad is going to happen to them, whether they might get into an accident and lose them forever. They might actually worry that something might happen to them. So persistent worry outside of that change environment, even at home, a persistent worry that something bad might happen to themselves, the child. They could get kidnapped, they could get lost, they could get somehow separated from their caregiver, and this occupies their mind as a persistent worry. They may also show a reluctance to go out in general, not wanting to go to the shops or to leave the house or to leave familiar territory. And again, there's quite a lot of distress about leaving a safe place where they can be guaranteed to be close to their caregiver. There can also be a fear of being alone. So you might actually also find that even in the same house, they may not want to be in a room that's separate from the caregiver. They may actually just fear actually being by themselves. It goes down to things like they may have a fear of sleeping outside of the home. So sleepovers, camps, especially in primary school age children, can be a terrifying thought for them. And you also might find that there might be nightmares as well as physical symptoms of nausea and headaches and stomach aches. Now, when you're getting 3 or more of those sort of clustering of symptoms, and it's been happening for more than 4 weeks, and the distress that you're observing is more than what you would expect of a child the same age, then there's probably separation anxiety disorder. And it's not a bad thing to actually have a chat with a health professional who can help you walk through how to help your child to feel safe and secure even when you're not there. In the meantime, some practical things that you can think about. Number 1 is you can actually practice some short separations even in the house. Just have times when you're all in your individual spaces doing your individual things where you might not be able to see one another, right? That just helps children to understand that even though they can't see you, being alone is not a bad time. And you might start that off with very small amounts of time, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, building up to 30 minutes for young children and older children. They can go beyond that. Number 2, one of the common things that I see in my clinic when I'm talking to children with separation anxiety is that they actually really just don't know what happens to mum or dad or their caregiver when they're separated. Where do they go? Do they get sucked into a big black hole? Does the vacuum cleaner suddenly come alive and threaten their mum and dad? Are they safe? What are they actually doing? Where do they go? So mapping that out for your child both ways, mapping out their day for them when they're separated from you. So if they're in school, you could draw a little bit of a picture map to help them see from the point where they say goodbye to you, the things that are going to happen for them at school or at preschool. They'll be playing, there'll be lunch, there'll be rest, there'll be this, and how do they know when that day is finished? And then you can also do a map for yourself. Do a little map of the things that you might be doing when they can't physically see you. And generally, I find when that is done, children actually realize that mum and dad or a caregiver actually have quite a boring life when they're separated. It's not as bad as they think. They're not going hang gliding. They're not jumping off cliffs. And they're not purposely putting themselves in front of harm's way. So map it out is the second thing. Then I'd say third is leave confidently. It's okay. When it comes time to leave, you want to perhaps settle them into an activity, leave them with another person whom they're comfortable with and trust. It could be a teacher. If with older kids, it could actually be a friend, a buddy. And that person or that leaving point stays consistent for a period of time until the children understand that that's the point where mum and dad or the caregiver is leaving, but they're going to be left with a familiar, safe point of contact. Often very noisy playgrounds, very noisy rooms, very noisy places might be difficult for children, particularly who have anxiety that's related to sensory overload. So you might want to arrange with the school or the classroom teacher a way that the separation happens in a much more muted sensory environment. Then the thing that I usually say to parents, it's okay if the separation is painful if you know that you can make the reunion joyful. Head for the joyful reunion. Have the same parting words and then have the same reunion words. So when you see your child, you might say something like, hey, so glad to see you. Let's go home. Or, hey, so nice to see you again. What shall we do today? What would you like for afternoon tea? And that way, the reunion becomes a predictable, anticipated activity that helps them to get through the day. So separation anxiety is a hard thing for parents to have to go through with their children. But you got to remember too, it's because they're moving from a stage where they're used to having you physically around to soothe their anxiety. And now they're needing to rely on some of the skills that you've given them and to actually build some trust connections with other people in their world. Eventually they do get there. If it's going on for more than 4 weeks and it's not seeming to disappear, then that's probably the time to seek some professional help. Okay, I'll talk to you later.